Okay, so the Cold War. I titled this PowerPoint presentation or keynote presentation on the brink of world destruction. And of course, what I mean by that is that during the Cold War, the world was continuously, well, not really continuously, not for the first few years, but by the time that the Soviets and the Americans had cruise missiles, the world was essentially at any point ready to be destroyed many times over by the power of the nuclear arsenals by the United States and the Soviet Union. So, here we go. So leading up to the Cold War, you have at the end of World War II, you have the two most powerful nations in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, organized on two opposing economic and political systems. The Soviet Union, based on communism after the Russian Revolution, and America based on capitalism and a lot more democracy. And then also at the end of World War II, you have the Americans discovering the atomic bomb and dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And briefly, America, because of the atomic bomb, has significantly more power in that particular respect than the Soviet Union. But America certainly didn't have enough of an arsenal initially after World War II to completely check the power of the Soviet Union's other armed forces. So, America's got the bomb, the Soviet Union and America are supremely powerful, and their economic and political systems are opposed. The Soviet Union wants to expand communism further around the globe, and the Americans and the Western Europeans want to stop it. And at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union has also taken over much of Eastern Europe and reorganized those countries under communist principles, and they're essentially satellites of the Soviet Union. And these are just some grisly pictures of the results of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This one in particular shows a shadow of an individual burned into some concrete steps. Like the light of the atomic bomb is so bright, many times brighter than the sun, that it actually bleaches everything that it touches. And so, here's a person standing here, and the light passes by him and is so bright that it bleaches the concrete. He casts a shadow, and then he's essentially instantly vaporized, turned into gas. Okay, so after World War II, Harry Truman, the U.S. president, creates the Truman Doctrine, or ascribes to the Truman Doctrine, and it is that America will fund and help any groups and countries that are fighting or opposing communism. And, this plan on the one side eventually helps the Americans, win, in quotation marks, the Cold War, because the Soviet Union collapses. And on the other hand, America, in an attempt to stop the spread of communism, arms everybody from future Al-Qaeda members to drug cartels in Central America, or at least helps indirectly finance drug cartels in Central and South America. So the Truman Doctrine, works in its explicit objectives of helping anybody who will fight communism, but it has some really harmful long-term effects. Whether it was worth it or not is certainly up to the individual, but it's easy to say that the Soviet Union, with their nuclear arsenal, certainly posed more threat to the world potentially than, say, an Al-Qaeda group. Okay, and the Marshall Plan is America's investing billions of dollars, American bankers investing billions of dollars into Europe to help them rebuild after the war destroys the landscape of their countries. And the idea is that if you can make these countries prosperous again, and orderly again and peaceful again, then they're much less likely to turn to militaristic dictators like a Hitler or a Lenin or a Stalin, even worse, a communist. Okay. And here's just some cartoons or ads from the day. Here's Joe Stalin, Kenny Blockade, and it's the Marshall Plan, right? It's the basketball, and it's going to European recovery. And then this over here is actually an advertisement for the fledgling European Union, or at least the organization that leads to the European Union, as Europe is constructed, Western Europe is constructed after World War II to eventually unify their economies as much as possible. Okay, the first event in the Cold War that almost leads to World War III is the Berlin Blockade. And here's the issues that start the Berlin Blockade. If you notice on this map, this border here, it represents the Soviet Union-controlled Eastern Europe over here, and the Western Europe on the other side, and it's being organized by the British, the French, and the Americans. And once the British and the Americans established democratic governments and capitalistic-based economies, the plan is to turn these countries over to the citizens. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, is essentially taking control of all of these countries where their armies stopped at the end of World War II, and had reorganized them as Soviet communist satellite states, so essentially ruled from Moscow. Now the problem here is Berlin. In Berlin, it had been agreed would be divided between the Soviet Union on one side and then the British and the French and the Americans on the other side. And eventually, this part, West Berlin, would be turned over to the Germans. So you essentially have a free, quote-unquote, city right here, and it's totally surrounded by the Soviet Union, or the Soviet satellite states. And so the Soviet Union would love to take back this city, West Berlin. And so what they do, because they don't want to start a war over getting West Berlin back, is they blockade the roadways going into West Berlin so that no food can make it to West Berlin. And the idea is, once these people start to starve, then they'll come over here and ask the Soviet Union to please come in and bring them some food, and the Soviet Union will then occupy and control all of Berlin. So, Joe Stalin blockades Berlin. Harry Truman flies planes over the blockades. And now Stalin can either shoot the planes down and start World War III, or let the parachutes, which is how the supplies get to the people, let the parachutes drop and leave the planes, and eventually give up on Berlin. And so these planes actually fly tons and tons of food per day into West Berlin to help feed the people. So in the end, Joe Stalin gives up. The Berlin airlift, as this is called, the flying the planes over, is a success. He fails to take over West Berlin. Okay, meanwhile in China, you have a civil war going on between communists and capitalists. Communists led by Mao Zedong and capitalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. And all this gets started. This slide is just showing you that the last Chinese dynasty, last Chinese emperor is overthrown in 1911. Briefly, China is led in a unified manner, so to speak, by Sun Yat-sen, who's a hero, a Chinese nationalistic hero who was able to unify both socialist and capitalist elements within China, but he dies, and then China dissolves. And here we have Chiang Kai-shek here, who loses the Chinese Civil War and flees to Hong Kong, and then, flees to Taiwan, and then we have Mao Zedong over here, who wins the Chinese Civil War, leading the Chinese Red Army, the communists, and who eventually take over in 1949 and unify China under principles of communism. Now, the important part about Mao Zedong winning the Chinese Civil War is that now you have the population on the planet with the largest population, the largest population on the planet, rather, ruled by communist principles. So now you have the Soviet Union is communist and China is communist, and so it looks like to the Americans and other countries in the West that communism is spreading, as it is. And so now you have the majority, essentially, of the largest continent on Earth unified, in quotation marks, under communism. The reality is Mao Zedong and Joe Stalin, while they were allies in some respects, they didn't get along great. They had opposed economic systems in a lot of ways, and so there was as much mistrust between the two of them as there was an alliance. The most famous military maneuver in the Chinese Civil War is the Long March. And the Long March was a fighting retreat over, I believe, 1,500 miles that the communists had to cover in order to get away from the much more powerful at the time capitalist nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. I believe the Red Army loses somewhere in between 70 and 90% of its population. That's soldiers and families all put together, and so they barely survive. But because they survive, they're able to reorganize, rearm, and come back and eventually defeat the nationalist forces. And these are just essentially at the very end of World War II, the nationalists controlled a much larger area than the communists up here, and this just shows you that the communists really they surprised the world by winning the Civil War. And Mao Zedong does it by building his political movement out of the peasants. And the peasants were hundreds of millions of people. And so by creating a mass movement of peasants, Mao Zedong really creates an unstoppable force. Okay, we talked about this. Communists win, and it's important because communism is spreading, and now America believes it has to redouble their efforts to stop the spread of communism. 1949, the Soviet Union explodes its first atom bomb, freaking out the Americans even more because now they have the nukes. And interestingly, the Soviets are given the plans to the bomb by a couple, the Rosenbergs, who work for the U.S. government, and they're actually both executed for treason, but they give the Soviets the secret to the atomic bomb in hopes of preserving world peace, because they believe that if only America has nuclear bombs, they would be more likely to start a war. But if the Soviet Union also have bombs, then both sides will be too afraid of the consequences to start a war. And for better or worse, this plan works. You have two alliance systems forming during the Cold War. NATO, which is still around, is a defensive alliance. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, led by America, and it's a defensive alliance. So if one NATO country is attacked, it's seen as an attack on all countries. And then you have COMECON, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which serves as mostly an economic alliance for trade among communist countries, but also serves as a de facto defensive alliance as well. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 is another example in the eyes of the West of the expanding motives of the communist empires, communist empire of the Soviet Union and the fledgling communist country of China. And originally in the Korean War, the Soviet Union, over here, they encouraged North Korea, and this is, you can see this border, this is where the Soviet army stopped in World War II when the atomic bombs were dropped. And not surprisingly, half of Korea is organized under communist principles, and half of Korea, South Korea, is organized under capitalist principles. And so the Soviets encouraged the North Koreans to invade South Korea and retake and unify the peninsula. The United Nations, which is formed at the end of World War II, and unlike the League of Nations, which had no military, the United Nations has a military, and they invade, mostly this is the American army, but it's the United Nations army, they invade the Korean peninsula at Incheon here, and drive the North Korean forces back towards the Chinese border. When the American forces get too close to the Chinese forces on the Chinese border, the Red Army comes across, and you actually have the Americans and the Chinese fighting each other for the first time and last time in history. The Chinese drive the Americans back across the 38th parallel, and both sides fight across this border for the next year and a half. And eventually, the Korean War is ended with an armistice, and this is not a peace treaty. So the idea is the two sides, North and South Korea, have temporarily agreed to stop shooting at each other, but both sides believe the war is going to restart eventually. And that's why The 38th parallel, this border right here, is the most heavily guarded border in the world. You have, I believe, about 1 million North Korean soldiers ready to come across in the north. You have 30,000 American soldiers and another, I believe, 500,000 South Korean soldiers on the south. And so the Korean War, with the invasion by communist North Korea into South Korea, is seen as another aggressive attempt at expansion by the forces of communism by the United States, which is another reason that the United States is more willing to get heavily involved in the Vietnam War. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches the first satellite into space, further freaking the Americans out, because being the first satellite, this represents an undeniable Soviet victory against the Americans in technology. And also, if the Soviets can shoot a rocket into space with a satellite, they can shoot a rocket to America with a nuclear bomb. And this begins the race for the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the ICBM. By the end of the Cold War, both the Americans and the Soviet Union have thousands of these, which can shoot up into space, cross the ocean, and come down on their opponents. And in the warheads of the ICBMs are multiple re-entry vehicles. And essentially, in the warhead of many of these intercontinental ballistic missiles, you have several separate nuclear warheads, each which can target another city. And so it doesn't take too many cruise missiles to destroy a whole ton of cities. The Soviet Union builds a wall around West Berlin that I'm sure you guys have all heard about before, and essentially the idea is it was very easy for people within Soviet satellite states of Eastern Germany, or the Soviet satellite state of Eastern Germany, to escape into the freer and more economically prosperous West Germany. And so the Soviets build a wall around it to prevent this from happening, and there's all sorts of cool and daring escapes from Soviet-controlled areas of Eastern Europe into Western Europe, sometimes done at the Olympics, particularly cool stories. Excuse me. Essentially, if you were escaping from a communist country and you could set foot on American soil, then you could almost instantly become a citizen. And so many people attempted this, and several were successful. The largest, and this is a hydrogen bomb, so a thermonuclear bomb ever exploded, is exploded by the Soviet Union in 1961, which I believe is 20-something megatons. It makes, the fireball it makes in the sky is, I believe, 5 kilometers wide. The shock wave created from this bomb actually encircles the Earth and goes around the Earth, I think 7 times. They can measure it. It's exploded here, right, close to Antarctica. It breaks windows in Finland here. And the hydrogen bomb, the most destructive bomb to come out of the Cold War, more destructive than nuclear bombs. Really some frightening stuff here. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which you've probably heard about before, but the Cuban Missile Crisis is when the world comes closest to a nuclear holocaust and mutually assured destruction, MAD, that ever happened during the Cold War. And essentially you have Kennedy, who's in control of nuclear missiles on the border between Turkey and the Soviet Union, which can essentially be in the Soviet Union nearly instantly, and then Khrushchev, who tries to even the score by putting Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. And these missiles could have reached Florida, I believe, in 15 minutes. And so Kennedy, wanting to really take a stand against the communist forces of Khrushchev and Fidel Castro, who in 1959 led a successful communist revolution in Cuba, Kennedy is going to push this issue right to the point of nuclear war. Essentially, Kennedy sends out the U.S. Navy to blockade Cuba, and then the Soviet Navy lines up right across from them, guns ready, and for several days, the navies of the United States and the Soviet Union are just waiting to see who's going to fire first. People are digging fallout shelters in their backyard. I mean, really, your average American thought at this point it was a pretty good bet that the entire world was going to be exterminated in a nuclear war. In the end, Kennedy agrees to pull the missiles out of Turkey, and so Khrushchev agrees to pull the missiles out of Cuba. Both of them don't feel good about taking the world to the brink of destruction, and so they decide after that point to try to establish better relationships with each other. They actually install a single phone line, the red phone, that goes from the White House all the way to the Kremlin, like a direct phone line. So anytime the President of the United States or the Premier of the Soviet Union are afraid that something might happen to start a war that's avoidable, they pick up the phone on one side and it rings on the other side. The Vietnam War, we've already talked about at length. But this is an example of the United States military engaged against the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese are supported by the Soviet Union and by China. In the end, America leaves this war and loses to the Vietnamese, and it's seen as a successful war of liberation for the Vietnamese, and is really is a national trauma for the Americans. Millions of people in Indochina, in Vietnam, and in Cambodia, and Laos die as a result of the American war, and 58,000 and change American soldiers die as a result of the war. The Soviet Union has a similar experience in Afghanistan, who they invaded in 1979, and America funds the Mujahideen, Islamic freedom fighters, the group that eventually it morphs into many groups, but one of them is Al-Qaeda. America funds these folks in a 10-year war against the Soviet Union, which is ultimately successful for the Afghan forces. This in many ways causes the Soviet Union to collapse economically, which leads to their political collapse. Unfortunately, the Americans at the end of this war completely pull funding out of Afghanistan, the country being destroyed in part because of the American effort, is a wasteland and erupts in a horrifying civil war, which eventually leads to the Taliban taking control. The Soviet Union collapses 2 years later in 1991. The Berlin Wall comes down, and the Soviet Union is then reorganized under a more capitalistic economy, much of which sadly ends up being controlled by organized crime. And this is Mikhail Gorbachev, the most famous Russian leader of the later Cold War. He's not the guy in charge when the Soviet Union collapses. That's Boris Yeltsin. But Mikhail Gorbachev is seen really as a hero for attempting to reform the Soviet Union politically and economically, allowing for more personal freedom and more economic freedom, and really being a man who promoted peace around the world as much as you can, being a nuclear power funding proxy wars. So that's Mikhail Gorbachev, always recognizable by his distinguishable birthmark on the top of his head, which in an episode of Saturday Night Live was found to be fake when Mikhail Gorbachev was depicted to be captured in a comedy skit, and the first thing the CIA agents did was pull out a hanky and wipe off the birthmark. The end.